This is Bullets with AWR Hawkins, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is AWR Hawkins.
Hey, welcome back to Bullets with AWR Hawkins. So happy to have as a guest this week Executive Director of Gun Owners of America, Erich Pratt. Gun Owners of America is out there. They're doing yeoman's work for gun rights. Of course, they are some people describe certain gun groups as the velvet glove of gun rights, and Gun Owners of America, they're the steel fist inside the velvet glove. And that's why, to me, it's an honor. I've spoken with Erich and Larry Pratt quite a bit and consider them both friends. So great to have them, or to have Erich with me today. Erich, I want to tee you up with a couple of things that Hillary said during the debate. I know you're more than ready for this. I'd like to start with her statement that the Supreme Court's decision in District of Columbia v. Heller, that it endangers toddlers. You know, that's a paraphrase, but she said very clearly that she was, quote, upset by that decision because it removed certain gun controls that were in place to protect toddlers. Can you fill us in on that, Erich?
Yeah, and AWR, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be with you. I was jumping out of my skin when I heard her say that. It was just so outrageously false because that case had nothing to do with toddlers. It dealt with a complete gun ban. You could have a gun if you were grandfathered in and it was broken down and disassembled, et cetera, but this had nothing to do with toddlers. You won't even find that word in the decision. So for her to claim that, she was outraged because of that, it was just simply a lie. But then we know that she lies. I mean, thanks to... amazingly enough, to WikiLeaks, we've seen all kinds of things that she has said, like it's proper to have a public position and a private position. In public, she says, well, I support the Second Amendment, but then in private, we hear her saying things like she wants to overturn the Heller decision. Now, thankfully, she was asked about this in the last debate, although she lied about it again. Case in point, you bringing up that she said that this case, the Heller case, was all about protecting toddlers, when really it wasn't. It was a total gun ban. But, as much as she lies, AWR, what she says openly should scare us. I mean, she supports the round-em-up gun confiscation policies of Australia, said that we should consider that here. She wants judges who support a living constitution, in other words, judges who ignore what the Constitution actually says and will use their opinions to reshape society. If we get that, that means turning the entire country into the gun laws that D.C. and Chicago have. To Trump's credit, he wants to appoint judges that rule according to the framers' intent. He said that in the last debate. But Hillary wants to overturn Heller. And, that's going to have real-life consequences. In fact, I was just thinking about this in terms of an article you wrote recently dealing with that Ohio couple that was awakened in the middle of the night, and they grabbed their firearm, held the armed intruder for the police, and the couple said, guns saved our lives. Well, just imagine now an America where Heller has been overturned. Judges no longer respect or protect the individual right to keep and bear arms. Cases like that could end very differently.
Oh, you're exactly right. And see, Erich, what you've done, you put your finger right on it. Heller was about the individual right. And, contrary to the claims of the Los Angeles Times, the New York Times, and so many other outlets that said otherwise, Heller was not where the Supreme Court created a right. It was a situation where they reaffirmed a right. That's a stark difference. And that is the foundation of the Heller decision, that the right to keep and bear arms is individual, not collective. That means it rests on my existence as a human, not on whether I served in the militia or not. That's a good way to explain that. So when you think about that, and you think about what you've stressed, Erich, that Heller is about the individual right, how can Hillary claim in any way to be pro-Second Amendment if she rejects the foundational principle that gun rights are individual. I mean, how can she even make that claim?
Well, she can't, honestly, and she's not honest, because if she supported the Second Amendment, and by the way, Tim Kaine, her running mate, has done the same thing. It's like a mantra that they have. Oh, I support the Second Amendment, but, and then they list all these gun control proposals that they favor. Of course, if they really supported the Second Amendment, as you said, the framers didn't create a right with the Second Amendment. That's important to understand. In the Declaration of Independence, they wrote that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. Rights are liberties that are given to us by God, the Creator, and they cannot be taken away from us. That's what inalienable means. They cannot be taken away. And the Second Amendment picks up on that, because it says that right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. So I would ask, how can you support the Second Amendment but then support all these infringements? It's a contradiction of terms. But, they probably haven't read the Second Amendment, quite frankly.
Yeah, she probably has a team of researchers that read it for her, and I'm not even being facetious. I mean, I think you're probably correct on that. I've stressed before, Eric. I stressed in our first podcast when Thomas Jefferson said that we were endowed with certain unalienable rights. Of course, he was saying endowed by our Creator. That means the rights came from God. You just explained that beautifully. But when he said they were unalienable, what he meant, you say that he meant they can't be taken from us. But if we look at that word and think about what that word means, it literally means that those rights, they can't be separated from us. Or shall I say,
exactly,
we can't be separated from them. They're part of our humanity. So God worked in our creation in a way that part of my humanity is the right to self-defense, which of course I do with a firearm, which is what our founders understood. So the right to own that firearm comes from God. It cannot be stripped from my humanity. Do you think Hillary ever has thoughts that even approach what we've discussed in the last 90 seconds? I'm being honest. I'm not being facetious. Do you think she ever thinks about that? And I know this is speculation, but just from her language, it seems to me Hillary thinks more about an atheistic state where all power comes from a group of people in D.C. and where rights are granted by them. We know that's not possible, but in her mindset, where rights come from government, not God, that almost seems to me to be the mindset of Hillary Clinton. And you correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I think you're right on point, and it's the difference between a right and a privilege. Rights come from God, whereas privileges is something that, if on your good behavior, you can continue to enjoy it. Or if I change my mind, parents may do that all the time with their kids. No, we're not going to do that anymore. Privilege taken away. That's the difference between privileges and rights. And you nailed it, saying that this really comes from an atheistic worldview. In fact, how many times did President Obama quote what we were talking about in the Declaration, but he left out a key word? By their Creator. I guess that's 3 words. But he would talk about how all men are endowed with rights, but he would leave out that they come from God. And so if they don't come from God, then how do you know what rights we have? Well, then it has to be whatever the 51% says we have. Well, what if the 51% changes their mind? Well, okay, we'll put it in a Bill of Rights. Well, what if we amend the Bill of Rights? And does that mean we no longer have those rights? See, that's the problem with this. If our rights don't come from God, then they're not going to be secure for long, at least not forever, because man is always changing his mind, and the majority vote will always change. But they're forever secure if our rights come from God, as our founders articulated.
Oh, that's so rich, Eric. I don't want to get too far afield, but you see, this is why I love you being a guest on the podcast, and it's why our listeners benefit from you being here, and I mean that. You spur thought, and by spurring thought, you help us educate ourselves, and I mean that. I'm not just saying that. And let me tell you what you've made me think about. Thomas Jefferson quoted, as you know, I'm not telling you anything, Eric. He quoted John Locke quite a bit, but he quoted William Blackstone twice as many times. William Blackstone, the Oxford professor, was his go-to guy for matters of natural law many times. And what William Blackstone said was that our rights and he was talking about the rights that are embodied and protected in the Bill of Rights. He says that those rights are absolute. Why? Because he that gave them is absolute. And since he that gave those rights always was, always is, always will be, those rights always were, always are, always will be. Now, I know the leftists hate that thought, but that is how our founders looked at freedom of speech, freedom of religion, the freedom to assemble, the freedom to keep and bear arms, the freedom to own property, the right to be secure in our persons, houses, papers, and effects. All, I could keep going. Throughout the Bill of Rights, it's not just the Second Amendment. They're all of a cloth. They're all given us by our Creator, and they are absolute. They are as much mine tomorrow as they were yesterday, not because I'm special, not because Gun Owners of America is a great group, but because they were given us by God, not government. We have got to get back to that message, Eric. And I know that message is not, it hasn't been rejected by you guys, and I know you continue that message, but we have to get that to the masses somehow. That's what I'm saying.
Well, in AWR, what we're talking about here is not just some ivory tower, pointy head discussion. This has real world consequences, because when you deny people their basic rights and you turn it into a privilege. So a classic example, before exercising your right to keep and bear arms, you have to go ask permission from the government to exercise that right to keep and bear arms. We commonly call that a background check. What happens there? You have just turned a right into a privilege, and people can end up dying as a result of that. I mean, I'm sure I know you know the case of Carol Bound in New Jersey, who her state authorities kept dragging their feet. She wanted a gun because her former boyfriend was threatening her. He was a big, huge guy. She was a very tiny woman. She knew she would have no chance. Yeah, she got a protective order, but she knew a piece of paper wasn't going to stop them. And so she wanted a firearm, and New Jersey, they drag out the background check process, and it took weeks. And sadly, her former boyfriend shows up at her house, and he didn't need a gun. He knifes her to death. He ends up killing her. It goes back to a right delayed is a right denied, and her right to protect herself, her right to life was denied her by state officials who, have turned this right into a privilege, saying, well, we're going to decide who's worthy to be able to exercise their God-given rights.
Think about what Eric just said. Those of you listening to this podcast, think about it. A right delayed is a right denied. And you can understand that so easily when you think about this. For someone to have the ability to delay my right, that means they have already inserted themselves between me and the exercise of that right. That's called infringement. That's what our founding fathers said shall not be done. Remember, the right to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. We have to get back to the things Eric is talking about, to the things I've tried to highlight a little bit along the way. But the things that Eric and Gun Owners of America are talking about, these are the things that we have to get back to if we want to protect liberty in our country, particularly as it relates to the Second Amendment. We're going to take a break, and then I'll be back with Erich Pratt, Executive Director, Gun Owners of America. This is Bullets with AWR Hawkins, a Breitbart News podcast brought to you by PodcastOne.com.
This is Bullets with AWR Hawkins, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is AWR Hawkins.
Hey, welcome back to Bullets with AWR Hawkins. This is a third segment for this podcast. Fortunate to be with Erich Pratt, or I should say to have Erich Pratt, Executive Director, Gun Owners of America, with us for this segment. He was with us in the last segment. In the last segment, Eric and I discussed the founders' understanding of freedom and the fact that our rights come to us from God, not from government. That, as Thomas Jefferson said, we are endowed with certain unalienable rights. And when he said we were endowed, he was reminding us that our rights don't come to us via congressional approval or popular vote or executive order. They come to us from God. And when he said that they were unalienable, he was saying they're part of our humanity. They cannot be separated from us. So that's crucial for us to understand. So Eric and I were talking about how we have to get back to that. We have to get back to where we understand the right to keep and bear arms is not a privilege. It is a right. It's mine. And the founders hedged it in. They didn't create it. They hedged it in so that we as Americans could defend our lives and our properties and our families. Eric and I talked about how in the last debate, Hillary tried to benefit from the Americans, the collective American ignorance on things by talking about Heller. She claimed that the Heller decision endangered toddlers, and that's a paraphrase, but that was her claim. In truth, the Heller decision reaffirmed the fact that the right to keep and bear arms is an individual right. We talked about how maybe a lot of Americans missed that. We hope they didn't. I know Gun Owners of America didn't. I know Eric didn't. I know a lot of you didn't. But Clinton also said something else, and she expects to get a pass on these things because, again, of how successful they've been in dumbing us down. Hillary claimed that 33,000 people a year die from guns. And that has to be seen in context. She began making that claim in November last year. She reiterated it in April this year. Breitbart News covered it both times. She's reiterated it a number of times since then. And many of her surrogates in Hollywood and elsewhere, they reiterate that same thing again and again and again. And the thrust of it is that 33,000 people die by gun violence each year. But that's not true. That's a 66% exaggeration, as I said in the first segment. In reality, the number of people killed each year, truly in a homicidal situation, where they die in what Hillary Clinton would call gun violence, on average, it's 10,000 to roughly 11,000, all right? 10,000 to 11,000 people a year. The left can't stick with that number, because it's really hard to sell gun control on 10,000 deaths a year. So they add in suicides, which number roughly 22,000 a year, and accidental deaths so that they can get the number up to 33,000, all right? That is how Hillary does what she does. Now, I reacted to that by pacing in front of the TV. I wanted to scream, but I didn't. I just listened. Eric, how did you react? And first of all, let me say, Eric, thank you again for being back with me for this next segment. How did you react when you heard Hillary make the claim that 33,000 people are killed with guns each year?
Well, I think you broke down the numbers real well. And I think one point that you made that is so crucial is that for the left, it's hard to sell gun control on 10,000 murders a year with a firearm, because there's lots of things that cause more death. If we were really going to make people safe, we would ban the wheel, because cars kill far more people than guns do. We would be banning sidewalks, because AWR, as you've written, people are 159 times more likely to be run over by a car than be killed in a mass shooting. And yet, what is it that you hear most on the news? Maybe on the local news you're going to hear about pedestrians being run over and that, but you don't hear that at the national level. And so it's only at the national level that, the media really amps people up about firearms. And, my goodness, if we're really concerned about toddlers, then, and I know this is going to sound silly, but why don't we ban hot dogs? Because USA Today wrote an article that there are some scientists who want a choke-proof hot dog because more kids are killed choking on hot dogs than guns every year. But of course, there's no war on hot dogs in the media or by Democrats. I mean, that would be just silly. So, as you pointed out, they need to inflate the gun death numbers to much higher levels, and then they report on only the negative uses, even though guns are actually being used far more often to save life than to take life.
Oh, Yeah, what an exceptional point. I know I've heard you talk before, Eric, on the number of times a gun is used each year to save life. And I mean, I think it's a perfect segue. So we're looking CDC numbers for 2013, and those appear to be the numbers that Hillary Clinton is lumping together. In CDC numbers, the number of homicides with a gun, I believe, are 11,200. So that's an approximation. 11,200 for the year 2013. Those are Centers for Disease Control and Prevention numbers. Now, how many justifiable gun uses were there? If we had 11,200 homicides with a gun, how many times was a gun used for justifiable reasons?
Well, the anti-gun left was stunned by the answer. In January of 2013, the president commissioned the CDC to study this. And after the CDC came back with their results, Slate magazine wrote an article about this, 10 surprising findings by the CDC. Well, one of them, which they weren't expecting, was how often guns are used to protect life. The CDC found it was anywhere from 500,000 to 3 million times a year. So, of course, if you bounce that against that 11,000 number that you were just talking about, that means guns are used to save life 45 times to 270 times more often than guns are used to take life through murder. That's very significant. Guns are obviously a net benefit, and things would be much, much worse if people weren't able to have access to firearms.
That figure is startling. And the thing that's amazing is just when you say it, it makes the wheels spin here. When you say that, I automatically know, well, I can tell you why they don't report that. Because what would it do if, I don't want to even name a shooting because I don't want anybody who lost a family member to think that I don't hurt for them and their loss in anything, whether it's gun related or not. So I'm not going to name it, but think of any particular incident that got a lot of attention. One incident. How would that sit with us if we were taking that news in the context of hurting for those people? You have to hurt for your fellow humans, but understanding, well, that for that one terrible gun use, there were upwards of 250 times more justifiable gun uses that day. How that to me is why they can't report on this, because that's how lopsided it is.
Well, and further to that point, over 98% of the mass shootings that actually occur in places where the guns are banned. They are gun-free zones. Law-abiding citizens cannot legally own guns in those areas. And yet, obviously, just saying that, just passing a law or regulation saying no guns in this area doesn't stop bad guys from taking guns into the area. And yet, there's so many examples of shootings that could have become a mass shooting, but they didn't because there was a concealed carrier on the scene. Just recently there was a shooting at a South Carolina school, and it was very tragic. The teenager shot and killed his father, and then he went to the local school and he shot 3 people there. But a firefighter heard the reports of that on the news or through the other avenues that they have, and he went to the school with his firearm and he stopped the shooter. Now, this story got a lot of media coverage, but much of the media only said that he, quote, took down the shooter. They didn't mention the fact that the firefighter did it with a gun. I mean, how are you going to take down a guy with a gun, unless you're a superhero or something, with, like Superman and, the bullets bounce off you. I mean, it's silly. You're not going to do that. And it's almost, it's dangerous to report things like that, encouraging other people, I'm just going to go tackle the guy. That doesn't usually go well. However, when you have a firearm, that is how these mass shootings or potential mass shootings get stopped. And, and there you see, AWR, that the bias against firearms, that even in a story where they're reporting it nationwide, they leave out the positive use of a firearm.
Oh, yeah, you're exactly right. Can Eric, this is for my own good, but it's also, I want the listeners to think about it again. In light of what you say, and in light of that fireman used a gun to save children and the teachers in that school. In light of that, tell us again, if 11,000 people were killed in homicides with guns in 2013, approximately 11,000, what were the figures you said? How many times more were guns used for justifiable purposes?
Well, according to the CDC, it's 45 to 270 times more often. Now, in a lot of those cases, in fact, over 90% of them, the gun is, and this should make liberals happy, it is an instrument of peace because nobody is shot. It's like that Ohio couple that we were talking about in the first segment. They brandished their firearm. They didn't shoot the bad guy. They just held him for the police, and nobody was shot or injured. Statistically speaking, that is over 90% of the self-defense uses in this country. So it's actually a relatively a minority of the time when the good guy is having to shoot the bad guy. And sometimes it happens, like the Minnesota Mall where that ISIS-inspired terrorist stabbed 9 people. Well, there was a concealed carry instructor who shot and killed him, and that put a stop to it. A South Carolina bar, shortly after the Orlando bar shooting, which everybody worldwide heard about. Hardly anybody heard about. Just 2 weeks later, there was a potential mass shooting at a bar in South Carolina, and there was a concealed carrier there who put a bullet into the bad guy, and that stopped it. So, sometimes the good guy does fire the gun, but in over 90% of the cases, it's like that Ohio couple.
Right. No, and I know I don't want to go too far afield, and this is anecdotal, but this is ironic. I've had to use a gun. I've had to pull a gun, I should say, in self-defense once, and my wife has too, and in neither case did we fire. Neither case did we have to. Seeing the gun did what you're talking about. The gun was a peacemaker. They saw the determination, were willing to use it, but just seeing the gun caused the person who was approaching her to flee. It caused the 3 or 4 people I had coming at me to reverse course. I've stressed before, Thomas Jefferson, if you paraphrase him, Thomas Jefferson believed that denying people the ability to defend themselves was denying them their humanity or part of their humanity. And that ties perfectly to the things you and I discussed regarding the Declaration of Independence in the last segment. So to me, these things all come together, and I see the media and Hillary Clinton and her surrogates working so hard to suppress the truth. But the truth that they suppress is this: having a gun saves your life. And it doesn't just save your life a little bit. It saves your life, as you said, so many times more often than it does harm. I believe you said 45 to 270 times more often. That is unbelievable. And I want that to soak into people.
Well, and I think if there's good news to this, even though despite their efforts to try to suppress this, gun ownership is up. For the last umpteen years that I can remember, whenever there were polls of how many, the percentage of households with guns in them, it was always somewhere in the mid-30 percentile. The Pew organization did a study just recently and found that it's now up to 44% of households, which is something that we suspected because, as you know, AWR, every month for the last 17 or 18 months has been a record breaker in terms of number of gun sales. So it was a bit incredulous to think that it was all people who already had guns that are just buying more guns. There are a lot of new gun buyers who have bought guns for the first time, and a lot of it has to do with the terror attacks. And I've talked to some of these people personally. That has rattled them, and they want to be able to get a firearm before they can't get a firearm because somebody like Obama or Hillary tells them that they can't do it. So if there's good news, is that we are now living in a much more pro-gun country thanks to Barack Obama.
Well, Eric, I want to ask you one last question, and we'll end our time. And I promise you, I wish we could stretch this segment out for another hour, and I mean that. I love having you on. You and Gun Owners of America, you've done some incredible work on gun-free zones, and I know you mentioned those a while ago. And I think this is important. Now, listeners, listen. Think about this. Please think about this. When you think about mass shootings or high-profile public shootings, whatever you want to call them, or even just high-profile shootings, because many of the shootings they list as mass shootings aren't. But when you think about the shootings that get a lot of attention, I want you to first to understand this. Contrary to claims, there's no commonality of weapon. The AR-15 does not dominate, as the left claims. The left depends on ignorant people to believe that. That's the only reason they say that. All right? You have handguns. Handguns are a very popular weapon because they're concealable, easy to sneak into a place. All right? AR-15s are used, don't get me wrong, but so are shotguns, and so are other types of rifles. So the commonality is not the type of weapon used. The commonality is not the race of the person. The commonality is not even the religion of the person. But there is a commonality, and it's gun-free status. The places that are hit for mass shootings, or chosen, for mass shootings, are not simply often, but almost always places where the perpetrator is guaranteed that the victims cannot shoot back. And trust me, Erich can explain this better than I, and that's why he's here. But gun-free zones are killing fields. Erich, you want to elaborate on that?
Well, I think you laid it out well. Again, over 98% of the mass shootings, public mass shootings that we've seen in this country have occurred in these gun-free zones where weapons are officially banned by rule or regulation or law. And you just go back through many of the more recent ones, the San Bernardino shooting, the Oregon Community College, the Orlando bar shooting, the Charleston and Chattanooga shootings from last year. Ironically, both Fort Hood shootings, because servicemen are not allowed to carry guns on them. The Aurora Theater shooting, the Navy Yard shooting. I mean, you just keep going through the list. In all these places, guns were not, they were banned for the average person. People were not able to have firearms. And by the way, in every single one of those shootings that I mentioned, the killer passed background checks to get his firearm. So both at the very beginning of the process and at the end of the process, gun control failed. It didn't stop bad people from getting guns, and once they got guns, there was nobody basically you had to wait for police or authorities to arrive, and a lot of people die during those 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes that people are waiting.
Right. And I want to make a point. Erich, number one, I know you're right, but I'm making this point for anyone who's a doubter, who's listening. A lot of people, when people talk about victims waiting, hiding, hoping the gunman doesn't find them while they wait 5, 10, 15 minutes for police to arrive. Anyone who thinks that scenario doesn't happen, I invite you, I don't invite you, I advise you to read on the Sandy Hook shooting. That's a shooting the left won't let go of that shooting. That Adam Lanza had over 9 minutes in that school building. Over 9 minutes with no armed response. Now you're the only armed person in that building, and your intentions are 100% evil. That undercuts a lot of claims the left makes. You know, they want to ban high-capacity magazines because of Sandy Hook. They want to ban AR-15s. But they don't understand, Erich, he could have had a 5-shot revolver. As long as he had a pocket full of bullets, he could kill as many people as he wanted because they couldn't shoot back, and he had 9 minutes where they were absolutely defenseless.
And, you know, I think that's why it's significant that the police, when they are interviewed about this, like the police1.com survey in 2013, over 80% of them favor teachers being armed in the schools. And an almost equal amount say that the way that you reduce these mass shootings is by having armed civilians who are able to defend themselves and protect themselves. And this is coming from the police. We call them the first responders. Technically speaking, they should be the second responders, because if you have people at the scene of the crime, the potential victims who can protect themselves and fire back, those then become the real first responders.
Eric, I want to keep my word. I said that was my last question, but with your permission, can I ask you one other question that has a really short answer?
Go for it.
Because you brought something up right there. Police should be the second responder. And I've often talked to people about this, and fortunately, when I talk to people about this, it's normally in a situation where they're already thinking about getting their first gun. So it's not a hostile conversation where they're screaming, or it's not shouting match stuff. But I try to tell people, I don't think, and I'm presenting this open-ended. You strike me down if I'm wrong, but I hope you can expound on it. I don't think our founders ever dreamed that Americans would live in a day or in a time when they depended upon representatives of the state to keep their families safe. I love police. I should say that. Support them 100%. I shake their hand every time I see them. Walking through a restaurant, officers working off duty, I shake his hand. Thank you for what you do. And if you're listening and you're an officer, God bless you, and I mean it. But at the same time, our founding fathers never dreamed that American citizens would trust their safety to agents of the state. I can't imagine them dreaming that a father would take his children to a restaurant without being prepared. Well, what if this happens in that restaurant? Can I protect them? I think that was the mindset that they passed down to us via the Second Amendment. I pass that to you to close, Eric. What do you say to that?
I say amen to everything you just said. And, I live in the state of Virginia. In the early 1600s, it was illegal to travel unarmed. And that just goes to your point. I mean, how things have changed. But for them, the primary duty of protection belonged to you. And like you, I'm very thankful for our military and police that protect us. And yet at the same time, it's a realization they can't be everywhere. Quite frankly, we wouldn't want them to be everywhere either. We have a Third Amendment to cover that. But they can't be everywhere to protect us. So that duty falls on us.
Oh. Eric, again, I know I've said it throughout the segments, but I want to say again, thank you. I appreciate you being with us. And again, to those of you listening, we've had the honor to speak with Erich Pratt today, the Executive Director at Gun Owners of America. You can read more about what they do at gunowners.org. Phenomenal organization. And Eric, thank you for being with me.
Oh, well, you're very welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much.
All right. This was Bullets with AWR Hawkins, a Breitbart News podcast brought to you by Podcast One. You can listen to this podcast every Tuesday. Find us on iTunes, please. Don't just listen, but also give us a review. We need a few 5-star reviews, and we hope that you continue to listen week after week. Thank you. God bless, and be back with you next week.